I'm Dan Nelson from Nelson & McCullough LLP in New York City. I represent professional photographers in copyright litigation. And it's with great regret that I found out this past week about the closing of the Stock Artist Alliance. Not because I feel the Stock Artist Alliance was particularly good at its mission of advancing the cause of stock professionals, but because I fear that the vacuum created by the closing of the Stock Artist Alliance and its advocacy, such that it was for its 45,000 or so members, won't be filled. And I believe that the sort of chicken and egg argument that rages on based on the shuttering of the Stock Artist Alliance is very bad for professional photographers and stock professionals in particular. The argument that stock photo licensing can't support a trade organization that advances the interests of stock professionals, to me, fundamentally misses the point. There has been an implosion of stock licensing in the last 10 years, and the fact that there was not strong advocacy for the photographers at the table in that discussion is, in my view, the reason why the industry has been able to collapse so quickly. With the major aggregators of stock photography engaging in very predatory behavior, and the failure of organizations like the Stock Artist Alliance and even the ASMP to stand up to the Getty Images of the world and advocate for the cause of stock professionals is the reason there aren't going to be stock professionals anymore in our lifetimes, and I think that's very unfortunate. You have the same sort of debate that rages on about the American auto industry, for example, but I can't imagine reading in the newspaper that all of the major unions for auto workers were shutting down. And I really can't imagine the sort of milquetoasty response coming out of the United Auto Workers that the American auto industry isn't strong enough to support a labor union that advocates for the cause of auto workers. I suppose if the major unions in America had done a very substandard job of advocating for the cause of workers, and workers could no longer afford to pay their dues because their salaries had been negotiated down to nothing, you'd have the exact same argument. But in my view, the reason that stock photography now costs nothing is twofold. First, you don't have the sort of antitrust considerations you should have stopping the de facto monopoly that Getty has acquired in the stock photography business. You also have complacent stock professionals who allow their valuable work to be sold for pennies on the dollar and allow their advocates to make the argument that they should allow it to be sold for pennies on the dollar because they'd rather have pennies than nothing. I think it's a very scary time for stock professionals to be considering the future and the future of licensing stock photography. And it's our hope that someone will step up and fill that void. Someone will say, this is very valuable stuff and it shouldn't be given away, and the fox shouldn't continue to guard the hen house. One of my first interactions with the SAA was when I asked them to give an opinion as to whether a new Getty subscription product was rights managed image licensing within the meaning of that term as it has existed for some time in the stock photography industry. And I remember that they refused to sort of go on the record one way or the other about whether it was or wasn't. And that was very curious to me because it was my understanding that the goal and the reason for the origin of the SAA was to take on Getty on precisely these sorts of issues on behalf of photographers. And the SAA was no longer inclined to do, frankly, what it was designed to do in the first place. And I remember thinking, isn't it your job to do it? Isn't that the purpose of your organization? And of course it was the purpose of their organization, but that organization had lost its way and lost its focus and had gotten in bed with the enemy. And that's my concern about a lot of the organizations that are left. The Picture Archive Council of America has Getty Images as one of its primary members and one of its primary sponsors. In fairness, though, the analogy between an auto labor union, for example, and the SAA breaks down because the Stock Artist Alliance was just a trade group and didn't have any teeth like a traditional labor union would have. And I think that that is partially the responsibility of photographers, that they haven't organized themselves in the way that other professions have. And I think that's part of the reason that they haven't been as successful in fending off this race to the bottom. I can't imagine a similar implosion in filmmaking, for instance, where actors suddenly started taking pennies on the dollar for their services. Photographers as a whole aren't that well organized, and that's why the aggregators have sort of won this race to the bottom, because no one will stand up and say, this is worth X, we won't do it for less than X. And the Screen Actors Guild, for example, is much more organized and much more effective at saying, if you want these services, you have to pay this amount. And photographers have never really done that, and it isn't clear at this stage if they're ever going to, but it's easy to put blame on organizations like the SAA who haven't done enough to fight those powerful interests and have paid the ultimate price. But some of the responsibility obviously has to be with the photographers, who are remiss to organize and stand up to those sorts of predatory behaviors. And as a result, their industry is in jeopardy. It's very interesting, as a still relatively young lawyer who represents professional photographers, to represent a profession that may not exist in my lifetime. And it's a very sad thing if it doesn't. And I have a lot of clients and friends who have produced amazing photography, and it is very difficult to watch the downward spiral of the stock photography business, because it's clear that there are several causes here and several places that you can point the finger: technology and mass sourcing and micro stock. But it should also be clear that there has been a failure of leadership on the part of those who were tasked with advocating for the cause of professional photographers. They haven't done well in advocating for that cause. And maybe it was a hopeless cause. Maybe it just wasn't something that was winnable, but we certainly regret the loss of the Stock Artist Alliance, and in particular, the loss of the original Stock Artist Alliance, whose stated goal and purpose was to advocate for the cause of professional stock photographers. And we certainly hope that someone will step up and fill that void and go to bat against the powerful interest on behalf of creative professionals whose work has value, and someone should fight for that value.